Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
The restaurant was filled with the kind of manufactured warmth that only came from expensive lighting, soft jazz, and the forced smiles of people who would rather be anywhere else but knew they had to pretend otherwise. The clinking of glasses, the hum of polite conversation, the occasional burst of laughter that never quite reached the eyes of the people producing it, all of it blended into a familiar background noise as I sat there, my hands folded neatly in my lap. My gaze locked onto the man standing at the head of the table. My father, Richard, was in his element, his voice smooth and assured, his expression full of satisfaction as he basked in the attention that had always come so easily to him. This night is special, not just for me, but for everyone who has supported me throughout my career, he said, raising his glass slightly, his eyes scanning the room before settling exactly where I knew they would, on Daniel, the son who could do no wrong. The golden child, the one who had been given every opportunity and still acted as though the world owed him more. But no one has been there for me the way my son has, my father continued, his voice thick with pride, his smile widening as Daniel leaned back in his chair, his own smirk growing with every word. Daniel has always been my right hand, my most loyal supporter, the one person I could always count on, no matter what. And that's why I want to take this moment to make something very clear. When it comes time to pass everything down, my estate, my assets, my legacy, it will all go to the person who deserves it most. The words were already forming in my mind before he even said them, because I had spent my entire life hearing some variation of them, had spent years watching my father reward Daniel for simply existing while I was treated as an afterthought. An obligation, an inconvenience that had to be tolerated rather than celebrated. "I'm leaving everything to Daniel," my father said, lifting his glass a little higher, his voice rich with finality. He was always there for me. The room erupted into applause, people nodding, smiling, acting as if they had just witnessed some grand, sentimental moment rather than an open declaration of favoritism wrapped in a thin veil of justification. My stomach twisted, but I didn't let it show, didn't let my expression shift, didn't let the simmering anger rise to the surface, because I wasn't surprised, wasn't even hurt, wasn't anything but ready. Daniel glanced at me then, the smirk still plastered across his face, his eyes gleaming with that familiar arrogance, that unshakable confidence that had been drilled into him from the moment he was born, the absolute certainty that he would always win, always come out on top, always be the one standing in the light while I was left in the shadows. His fingers drummed lightly against the table, his body relaxed, his entire demeanor oozing victory as if this was just another confirmation of something he had always known. And maybe, for the first time, he was right, because I had always known, too. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the envelope in my lap, the crisp edges of the letter that had been carefully prepared, the single piece of paper that would change everything. My pulse was steady, my breathing even, my mind clear as I finally reached for my glass, lifting it in a way that mirrored my father's, my smile small but unwavering as I stood. The conversations around us began to quiet, the attention shifting ever so slightly, the atmosphere shifting just enough to let me know that people were starting to notice. "That's funny," I said, my voice light, almost amused, the kind of tone that made people lean in, made them pay attention, made them realize that something unexpected was about to happen. I turned my gaze to my father, locking eyes with him, watching as his expression shifted ever so slightly, a flicker of curiosity passing over his face before settling back into its usual self-assured calm. "Because he was also stealing from your account for 3 years. The silence that followed was absolute. It spread across the room like a ripple in still water, slow at first, subtle, almost imperceptible, before crashing over everything, drowning out every other sound, suffocating the air itself. My father's glass hovered midair, his fingers tightening around the stem, his lips parting slightly as his brows furrowed, as if he wasn't sure he had heard me correctly, as if his mind was struggling to process the words that had just been spoken. Daniel's smirk was gone. His entire body went rigid, his jaw clenching so hard I thought I heard his teeth grind, his fingers curling into fists against the table, his skin suddenly a shade paler than it had been a moment ago. His eyes darted toward me, then to the envelope I was now holding out, the weight of it hanging between us, the unspoken truth pressing down on him like a vice. "What is this?" my father finally asked, his voice quieter now, slower, more careful, as if he was afraid of the answer. I didn't blink, didn't falter, didn't let the moment slip away. "It's a letter from your lawyer," I said simply, placing the envelope on the table in front of him, watching as his hands hesitated before reaching for it. "Everything you need to know is right there." I stepped back then, letting the tension settle, letting the realization take hold, letting the weight of the truth crack the perfect illusion that had been built around my brother for years. The air in the room felt heavier now, charged with something dangerous, something electric, something that couldn't be ignored. And for the first time in my life, I watched as Daniel lost. For a long, stretched-out moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke, and nobody even seemed to breathe, as if the weight of my words had sucked all the oxygen from the room, leaving nothing but an eerie, suffocating silence in its place. My father's hand remained frozen in midair, his fingers still wrapped around the delicate stem of his wine glass, his expression stuck somewhere between curiosity and disbelief, his mind struggling to process the reality of what I had just said. Across the table, Daniel had gone deathly still, his normally smug face now drained of color, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line, his eyes darting between me and the envelope as if willing it to disappear. I watched as my father's fingers finally moved, hesitantly reaching for the letter I had placed before him, his movement slow, careful, as if he were afraid of what he was about to find inside. The paper made a faint rustling sound as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning the first few lines, his brow furrowing ever so slightly, his expression still hovering on the edge of confusion, not yet fully understanding what he was looking at. And then, as he kept reading, as his gaze flickered over the numbers, the dates, the documented transactions, the unauthorized withdrawals, the evidence so carefully compiled that there was no room for doubt, I saw the exact moment the realization hit. His face went pale. The fingers holding the paper began to tremble ever so slightly, the glass in his other hand lowering to the table with a faint clink, his entire body suddenly rigid, the confidence, the pride, the satisfaction from earlier now completely wiped from his features, replaced by something raw, something unsettled, something dangerously close to horror. His lips parted as if he wanted to speak, but no words came, no immediate denial, no angry outburst, just a sharp inhale as his eyes snapped up, locking onto Daniel with a look I had never seen before. One that carried an unfamiliar mix of betrayal and fury, one that made even the most arrogant man in the room seem small. Daniel finally broke the silence, his voice cracking slightly as he forced out a nervous laugh, one that was meant to sound dismissive, but instead landed with the shakiness of a man scrambling for an escape route he already knew didn't exist. This has to be a mistake," he said, shaking his head, his fingers curling into fists against the table, his knuckles white. "Dad, come on, you know Olivia's always been dramatic, shut up." The words came low, sharp, and immediate, cutting through the air with more force than I had expected, more finality than I had ever heard from my father before. Richard wasn't looking at Daniel as a son anymore. He was looking at him as something else entirely, something that disgusted him, something he couldn't quite believe had been sitting beside him all these years without him ever noticing. The tension was unbearable, the energy in the room shifting into something that made the guests uneasy, some of them glancing at each other, some of them pretending to focus on their drinks, some of them gripping their forks like they weren't sure if they should keep eating or get the hell out of there before things exploded. I leaned back in my chair, my expression calm, my breathing steady, because unlike my father, unlike Daniel, unlike every single person at this table who had just been blindsided, I had been ready for this moment. Because I had known for months. I had first noticed it nearly a year ago, when I stopped by my father's house one evening and happened to glance at a stack of mail sitting on the kitchen counter, a bank statement lying partially open, just enough for my eyes to catch something that didn't quite make sense. A withdrawal larger than usual, a transaction that didn't match up with anything my father had ever mentioned, a pattern that shouldn't have been there. At first, I told myself I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into something that probably had an explanation, that I was just looking for a reason to resent Daniel more than I already did. But then, I started paying closer attention. A check that went missing. A payment my father didn't remember making. A transfer that led to an unfamiliar account. I asked subtle questions, nudged conversations in ways that might give me answers, listened carefully when my father talked about his finances, about how Daniel had been helping with some of the paperwork lately, about how it was nice to have someone he trusted take care of things for him. So I didn't say anything, not at first. I waited. I watched. I gathered every piece of proof I could, combed through bank records, traced the transactions back to accounts I wasn't supposed to know about, found every loophole, every deception, every lie Daniel had built his little empire on. Then I took everything to a lawyer, made sure every accusation was airtight, made sure that when I finally chose my moment, there would be no room for Daniel to talk his way out of it. And now, here we were. Tell me this isn't true. My father's voice was lower now, quieter, but somehow heavier, filled with something I had never heard from him before, something sharp and unforgiving. He was still staring at Daniel, the letter clutched tightly in his hand, his jaw clenched, his entire body rigid with barely contained fury. Daniel swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly now, his eyes darting around the table, searching for someone, anyone, who might step in and defend him, someone who might smooth this over, who might make this go away. But there was no one, no familiar safety net, no adoring glances from our father, no comforting reassurances from guests who had always assumed the golden child could do no wrong. There was just silence. And me, watching as Daniel's world began to fall apart. The silence that followed my father's demand stretched longer than I expected, thick and suffocating, wrapping itself around the table like a noose tightening with every passing second. Daniel sat frozen, his face drained of color, his fingers twitching slightly against the tablecloth as he tried to formulate a response, his mouth opening and closing like a man struggling to breathe through the weight of his own downfall. He had spent his entire life with an escape route, had always been able to charm, lie, or manipulate his way out of trouble, had never once faced a situation where he wasn't the one in control. But now, as my father sat across from him, letter in hand, rage simmering just beneath the surface, Daniel was beginning to realize that for the first time in his life, there was no way out. His eyes darted across the table, searching desperately for someone to come to his defense, someone to laugh it off, someone to turn the conversation in his favor, but no one spoke, no one moved, no one even looked him in the eye. The same people who had once hung on his every word, who had nodded along to every story about his supposed brilliance, who had always assumed that if there was a problem, it certainly wasn't Daniel's fault. They were now staring at him with something closer to discomfort, uncertainty, even disgust. "Dad," he finally said, forcing out a dry, humorless chuckle that didn't reach his eyes, his voice shaky, but still clinging to the same entitlement that had been drilled into him from childhood. "Come on, you don't actually believe this, do you? You know Olivia, she's always been—" My father slammed his fist down onto the table so hard that the silverware rattled, the sound sharp and violent against the delicate clinking of half-filled wine glasses. "Don't you dare," he growled, his voice low and unsteady, filled with a kind of rage I had never seen from him before, the kind of rage that came from realizing you had been made a fool of, that everything you had believed, everything you had trusted, had been nothing but a carefully crafted lie. His grip on the letter tightened, his knuckles going white as his breath came in slow, uneven bursts, his mind clearly struggling to process the full weight of what he had just learned. "Don't you dare try to turn this around on her." Daniel flinched at the venom in his voice, his confidence faltering further, his hands clenching into fists before relaxing again, his mind racing to find some sort of angle, some sort of lifeline that could pull him out of this. "Dad, I swear," "It's not what it looks like," he tried again, his voice thinner now, lacking the usual certainty, lacking the casual arrogance that had always allowed him to coast through life without consequences. "I was just handling some things for you, trying to handling things." My father let out a sharp, bitter laugh, shaking his head in disbelief, his eyes narrowing as he flicked through the papers again, scanning the long list of withdrawals, the wire transfers to unknown accounts, the months, no, years, of carefully calculated theft that had gone unnoticed because he had trusted Daniel to handle it all. "You stole hundreds of thousands of dollars from me," he spat, the words practically shaking with fury, his face contorted into something that looked dangerously close to disgust. "You stole from your own family, and you have the audacity to sit there and act like it's some misunderstanding?" The weight of the accusation settled over the table, pressing down on Daniel so hard I thought he might actually snap in half from the sheer force of it. He opened his mouth again, but this time there was no excuse waiting, no smooth lie ready to spill from his lips. Nothing but the dawning realization that he had been caught, fully and completely, with no room to maneuver. No way to twist the story in his favor. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, my fingers tracing the rim of my wine glass as I watched him unravel, watched the carefully constructed version of himself that he had built over the years collapse piece by piece. I had waited for this moment, had imagined it in a dozen different ways, had pictured the exact second when Daniel would realize that he had finally lost, that there was no coming back from this, that he had run out of second chances. And now, here it was. I thought about the day I had walked into the lawyer's office, sliding the neatly organized files across his desk, my heart pounding with a mixture of vindication and quiet rage as I explained exactly what I had uncovered. I had expected him to be skeptical at first, had expected him to hesitate, but instead, he had simply nodded, as if he had seen cases like this before, as if it wasn't the first time a golden child had thought they could get away with anything just because they had spent their entire life being told they were untouchable. "You were right to bring this in," the lawyer had told me, flipping through the documents, his expression unreadable. "This isn't just a few bad decisions. This is fraud. This is theft. And if your father presses charges, this could very easily become prison time." That was the moment I knew I had him. That was the moment I knew Daniel had finally backed himself into a corner he couldn't escape from. And now, watching the way his hands shook against the table, watching the way his eyes darted toward the exit as if he was already considering running, watching the way the people who had always adored him were now whispering behind their hands, I knew he was starting to understand it, too. "I trusted you," my father said finally, his voice lower now, more controlled, but somehow worse than the anger, somehow heavier than the shouting. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me?" Daniel didn't answer. Couldn't answer. And then, as if deciding that he had seen enough, my father straightened his shoulders, his jaw tightening as he exhaled slowly, letting the reality of the situation settle over him completely before finally delivering the final blow. "You're done," he said, his voice firm, his decision final. "You're cut off. Completely." Daniel inhaled sharply, his entire body tensing, his eyes going wide with something dangerously close to panic, but I wasn't done yet. Because I still had one more revelation to drop. I exhaled slowly, stretching my arms above my head as if I had all the time in the world, as if I hadn't just watched my brother's entire existence begin to crumble beneath him, as if I wasn't about to deliver the final blow that would bury him for good. The air in the room was thick with tension, a quiet, suffocating kind of stillness that made the weight of the moment feel heavier, sharper, like the edge of a blade hovering just above Daniel's throat. He sat there motionless, his fingers still curled into fists against the table, his eyes darting between our father and the envelope that had just sealed his fate, his breath coming in short, uneven bursts, as if he was trying to convince himself that there was still a way out of this. I watched him carefully, watched the way his jaw clenched and unclenched, watched the flicker of desperate calculation flash across his face, watched the exact moment he realized that no one was coming to his rescue this time, that no amount of fast talking or charming smiles would be enough to undo what had already been set in motion. And yet, I could tell he still thought he had a sliver of hope, still believed that if he could just regain control of the conversation, if he could just manipulate our father's emotions the way he always had, then maybe, just maybe, he could survive this. I almost felt bad for him. Almost. I sighed again, louder this time, tilting my head slightly as I tapped my fingers against my wine glass, letting the silence stretch just a little longer, letting Daniel sweat just a little more, letting the weight of my father's furious glare press down on him like an iron vice before I finally spoke again. You know, I mused, dragging out the words like I was just now remembering something important, like I wasn't about to drive the final nail into his coffin. It's actually kind of funny. Daniel's head snapped toward me, his body so tense he looked like he might snap in half if I so much as breathed in his direction. What the hell is funny? He snapped, his voice tight, his anger now laced with something else entirely panic. I smiled, slow and deliberate, watching as the color in his face drained just a little more. Oh, I murmured, my voice light, almost playful, just that you seem really upset about getting caught stealing all that money when, honestly, that wasn't even the worst thing you were planning to do. For a second, I thought the entire table might collapse under the sheer force of the silence that followed. Daniel blinked, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard, his fingers twitching like he was resisting the urge to reach for something, maybe a drink, maybe his phone, maybe some imaginary safety net that no longer existed. I don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice was weaker now, lacking the usual bravado, lacking the unwavering confidence he had worn like armor his entire life. Oh, Daniel, I sighed, shaking my head in mock disappointment. Of course you don't. I turned toward my father then, shifting the full weight of my attention onto him, watching as his rage flickered into something closer to wary suspicion, watching as he braced himself for whatever revelation was about to come next. Dad, I said slowly, drawing out the moment just a little longer, you might want to sit down for this one. He didn't sit. He just stood there, fists clenched at his sides, eyes locked onto me with an intensity that made it clear he was done playing games, that whatever patience he had left was hanging by a thread, that he needed me to get to the point before he completely lost what little control he had left. I tilted my head slightly, my smirk widening just a fraction before I finally said it. Daniel wasn't just stealing money from you, I murmured, my voice low and steady, watching as my father's jaw tightened even further. He was planning to sell the lake house. The words landed like a gunshot. My father's face went completely still, his entire body going rigid, his breath hitching just slightly, just enough for me to notice, just enough to let me know that I had hit him exactly where I wanted to. Across the table, Daniel let out a sharp, choked noise, part denial, part pure, unfiltered panic, his hands now gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. That's a damn lie. I held up a hand, silencing him effortlessly. You can deny it all you want, I said, reaching into my purse and pulling out another envelope, this one much thinner, much smaller, but just as deadly. But the paperwork says otherwise. I slid it across the table toward my father, watching as he hesitated for only a second before snatching it up, tearing it open with shaking fingers, his eyes scanning the contents with the same growing horror that had overtaken him earlier. I already knew what he was reading, the initial agreements, the emails between Daniel and a buyer, the timeline he had carefully planned out, all of it documented, all of it undeniable, all of it pointing to one inescapable conclusion. Daniel had been planning to cash out big, to sell one of the most valuable properties in our family, the place that had been in our family for generations, the place where my mother's ashes had been scattered, the place that meant everything to my father. And he had been planning to do it behind our father's back. The sound of the paper crumpling beneath my father's tightening grip was the only sound in the room for a long, stretched-out moment. His breathing was harsh, uneven, his face rapidly shifting between disbelief, fury, and something far more dangerous, something colder, something that promised there was no coming back from this. Daniel had finally lost. Completely. Finally, my father turned toward him, his expression unreadable, his voice so low, so controlled, so terrifyingly quiet that it sent a chill down my spine. "Get out of my house." Daniel stood there for a moment, completely frozen, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts as if his brain was struggling to keep up with the reality of what had just happened, as if he still believed, even now, that there had to be a way out of this. His hands were clenched so tightly at his sides that I thought he might actually throw a punch, his entire body radiating barely contained rage. The kind of blind fury that only comes from a lifetime of never facing consequences and then suddenly being forced to choke on them all at once. His lips parted like he wanted to say something, wanted to hurl one last insult, one last attempt at twisting the story in his favor, one last desperate plea for someone, anyone, to take his side, but no one spoke, no one moved. No one dared to look him in the eye. He wasn't Daniel, the golden child, anymore. He was just a man who had finally run out of lies. I didn't say anything as I watched him turn on his heel, his footsteps heavy against the polished hardwood floor, his breath uneven as he stormed toward the door, his entire body vibrating with the force of his own humiliation. There was something deeply satisfying about the way no one followed him, no one rushed after him to comfort him, no one tried to smooth things over, no one even pretended like they wanted him to stay. For the first time in his life, Daniel was alone. The door slammed behind him with a sharp, echoing finality, the sound ricocheting through the room like the last note of a song no one wanted to hear anymore, the final chord of a performance that had gone on far too long. A few seconds of thick, suffocating silence followed, the air still heavy with the weight of what had just unfolded, the tension wrapping around the guests like an invisible force pressing down on their shoulders, making their wine glasses feel heavier. Their smiles feel more forced, their hands fidget against the silverware in awkward discomfort. And then, as if on cue, the soft murmur of conversation started again, hesitant at first, forced and unnatural, a few fake laughs here and there. An awkward attempt at pretending that the party hadn't just been turned into the social equivalent of a crime scene. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some of them exchanging careful glances, others still staring at the door like they expected Daniel to come storming back in, like they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed, like they were trying to decide whose side they should be on. I didn't care. I had never cared. Because no matter how much my father had spent years worshipping Daniel, no matter how much this family had always placed him at the center of every conversation, every event, every single moment that was supposed to belong to someone else, he wasn't the center of this moment. I was. And I had no intention of giving that up. I reached for my glass, taking a slow sip of wine as I let my gaze drift across the room, letting the satisfaction settle deep in my bones, letting the victory linger on my tongue like something rich and sweet, something I had waited far too long to taste. My father was still sitting there, completely still, his hands resting on the crumpled paperwork in front of him, his jaw clenched so tightly that I could see the tension in his neck, his breath slow and controlled. The kind of forced composure that only came when someone was desperately trying to keep from completely losing their temper. He had spent years believing Daniel was untouchable, had spent his entire life making excuses for him, had spent this very night praising him in front of a room full of people, and now? Now, he was just another man who had trusted the wrong son. I should have felt some sense of triumph at the way he sat there, too ashamed to look at me, too humiliated to acknowledge that he had spent his entire life backing the wrong horse, but the truth was, I didn't need his validation. I never had. Because a long time ago, I had learned that there was only one person in this family who had ever really seen me. And she was gone. I had found the letter a few days earlier, tucked away in an old box of forgotten belongings, buried beneath stacks of photos and faded birthday cards and small fragments of a life I had once desperately wanted to escape. The paper had been folded and refolded so many times that the creases had softened, the ink slightly smudged in places, my mother's handwriting as familiar as the sound of her voice in my memory, the gentle, careful strokes of her pen forming the words she had never been able to say out loud. Olivia, one day you're going to understand that you never needed their approval to be worth something. One day, you're going to look around and realize that you never needed to prove yourself to them because you were never the one who was lacking. You are not difficult, you are not too much, and you are not unworthy just because they never took the time to see you. They will spend their lives chasing a version of love that is conditional, that is fragile, that only exists as long as they can mold it into what they think it should be. But you, my love, you are free. You are whole, with or without them. And one day, they will realize that they needed you far more than you ever needed them. I folded the letter carefully, pressing my fingers against the edges, feeling the weight of it settle deep in my chest, an anchor in the storm, a reminder that I had always been enough, even when they had refused to see it. I set my glass down, pushing back my chair as I stood, my movements slow, deliberate, unhurried, as if I had nowhere else to be, as if I had all the time in the world. My father didn't look at me, didn't say a word, didn't try to stop me as I turned and walked toward the exit, my heels clicking softly against the floor, each step echoing with the quiet finality of a decision that had already been made. I didn't need his money. I didn't need his inheritance. And I sure as hell didn't need his acknowledgement. Because I had already won.